Why don't we get started? So my name is Pam McNerney. I am your host for tonight. Welcome to our Genealogy. We're so glad to see all of you here. So after the event, we will be selling books. There's some here, there's some on the register on the other side, and then we'll be signing books at the register near the door. And we do ask that you purchase the book first before you have it signed. But most of you are taking care of that already, so good job on that. So I'm pleased to introduce Lisa Belkin, the author of Genealogy of Murder, 4 Generations, 3 Families, and 1 Fateful Night. She is an award-winning journalist and the author of narrative nonfiction books, including Show Me a Hero, which I think we also have available for, yes? For another one of your books.
I hope so.
Yes. We have that, and also you can purchase that. It's available for signing. That became an HBO miniseries. Her career at the New York Times includes stints as a national correspondent, medical reporter, and contributing writer for the New York Times Magazine. She lives in Westchester, New York, but she's staying at the Madison Beach Hotel. So I will,
Which is a segue.
that's right.
Of sorts. So I tried not to do a lot of reading because I think we need to get the book to do that. But I do want to read the first paragraph of this book, the paragraph that opens the book, and you'll understand why it is so particularly special to me to be here tonight. The chapter is beginning, it's Friday, July 8th, 1960, Madison, Connecticut. They look like any young married couple at the Connecticut shore a few days after Independence Day. He, compact and bespectacled, reclining in a sling-back canvas chair in the shade of a striped umbrella that proclaimed the Madison Beach Hotel. She, on a blanket spread for her by an attentive summer worker, her red hair tucked beneath a floppy hat, book in hand, squinting in the brilliant mid-morning sun. A casual glance would give no hint that he brought her to this beach because he could not think of what else to do, how else to help. The story, as I first heard it, the story that became this book, was told to me by the he in that paragraph, who was my stepfather, Alvin Tarloff, who at the time of this trip to the beach and the stay at the Madison Beach Hotel, was a 30-year-old doctor, and he was drafted into the Army and was stationed at the Stateville Penitentiary in Chicago. And at the time he told me the story, he was relatively recently married to my mother. It was a late in life marriage. It truly had nothing to do with different. The words aren't from. It was a late in life remarriage. I did not know him well. He and my mom, soon after they got married, she was almost 80, he was almost 90, and they moved from New York, where they had been living, to Tucson, Arizona. And I visited periodically. So here's a man who was my stepfather, but who I did not really know well. And in trying to get to know me better, he had started reading a previous book of mine, which Show Me a Hero, which had just been greenlit for a miniseries. So this was, a doting, interesting stepdad doing something to get to know this fully grown woman in his life, who oddly was also now his stepfather. And we sat down at breakfast, and he looks at me and says, "Your book, Show Me a Hero, your book reminds me of a story." And he proceeded to talk. And I didn't know Al well, but I knew enough that I understood he spoke slowly, he spoke long, and it was worth waiting for the end. And so basically I just listened. And he told me the tale of when he was a 30-year-old doctor. He was stationed at the largest maximum security prison in the country, Stateville Penitentiary, outside of Chicago. And he befriended a prisoner. Al was there to run medical experiments on prisoners. The Army desperately needed a cure for malaria. And it was, it decimated American troops during World War II. It did the same during Korea, and we were now heading in 1960, heading toward Vietnam. And these had been ongoing experiments to find some sort of prophylactic drug for malaria. And a series of physicians have been stationed inside this prison to run experiments on prisoners. Something that is completely illegal now, but at the time seemed somewhat patriotic, which shows you how times change. And also the pendulum of punishment to rehabilitation that has gone back and forth in American prisons throughout American history was very much on the rehabilitation side at that particular moment. And so not only were prisoners subjects of the experiment, they were also training in these labs as lab techs, among other things. And one of these lab techs became somewhat friendly with my stepfather. Again, just as you wonder, can a prisoner actually consent to be subject of an experiment? How real is a friendship forged between a doctor and a prisoner in a lab? But it felt like a real friend. And Al came to know a man named Joseph DeSalvo, and came to believe that he had been rehabilitated, came to understand that he was very much like himself. He was, Al was brilliant, as arguably was Joe. Al was much of an autodidact, as arguably was Joe. Joe at one point asked my stepfather for help with the parole board. My stepfather, who does nothing rapidly or without great care, researched how one is successful on parole. Determined that then, as now, the best thinking of the time was that it's getting you a job when you get out, getting you a place to live, and getting you out of the water you swim in. In other words, getting him out of the Chicagoland area, which is where he had his life of crime, and taking these new skills he was being taught. He came to Norwalk, Connecticut, which is where my stepfather, Al, had trained himself. And now he got Al a job in a lab in Norwalk, Connecticut. And he proceeded to tell me how Al had done very well in this new job. And then one day, Al was on vacation with his wife and 3 children, was heading to the Madison Beach Hotel because his wife was having what would turn out to be, in retrospect, the beginning of a psychotic break. He just recognized that he needed to get her out of town on vacation. Joe called because he was close by and said, I need to see you, I need to see you. And Al said, I need to take my wife to the beach. And things that following weekend went terribly wrong. And a police officer in Stamford, Connecticut, right near Norwalk, died. And I'm listening to this story and all that came after it, which you're gonna have to read to find out. And I looked at him and I said, you know I have to write about this, don't you? And he said, well, if you must. And what happened after that was multifaceted. It was the beginning of me getting to know this man, my stepfather. By writing about him. It was an exploration of a moment in time that what first attracted me to the story. The reason I said, I have to write about this, was I was struck by the idea that there were 3 men, a stepdad, Joseph DeSalvo, and David Troy, who was the police officer who was shot the night their 3 lives collided. They were 3 men who had arguably started at the same starting line. Right? They were all 30 years old or thereabouts in 1960. They had all lived through all of the same world events that shape a generation. And the question I began with is, how did one become the officer, one become his killer, and one become my stepfather, who inadvertently, with the best of intentions, but indisputably set this shooting into motion. So the first thing I did was I checked Al's facts, right? Here was this elderly man telling me this story about something that had happened at the time, it was 54 years ago, in the summer of 1960. This week, 1960?
Yeah.
Next week,
Yeah.
next week. And every checkable fact checked out, every knowable fact checked out, which was fairly stunning, I thought, for almost 90-year-old man. He had the city right, he had the date right, he had the names right, he was a good source, says the journalist of 40 years. And the next thing I did was went to find the other families, because this was now a story of a braided story of 3 families, to find what their memories were, because I was beginning to realize I was writing a book about memory and about how stories are handed down. And I first looked for David Troy's descendants, and found them fairly easily, mostly on Facebook. And I emailed his eldest daughter. So the children on the night of the shooting were 4, 3, and 6 months. And I emailed the oldest of those, Doreen Troy, who was here tonight, with her sister Diane, who were the 4-year-olds and the 3-year-old. And strangest email I ever sent began, this may be the strangest email you've ever received, but I'm writing a story, and what do you remember? And you remember nothing. So Al was passing down a story, and the family then became, their family became the next source of stories. Your facts checked out pretty well, Evelyn. This is David Troy's sister-in-law, right? And then I tried to look for the killer's family. And we are the memories we hand down. We are the tales we tell. And some families live on in those vibrant stories, and some disappear completely. And the DeSalvo family was gone, which was, another lesson of all of this. Not to give away the ending, but this was a man who died young. He had one brother who died young, and his parents died within a year of the 2 of them. The brother had 2 children who died young, and there was no one left to say, this is what they were like as a child. These were the traditions. They had all but disappeared. So I had Al, and I had his memories, and I had his stories, and I had some of David Troy's memories and tales from his life, because some of those existed. And what did I have of this man who killed their father? I had his prison record. I had a FOIA request from the state of Illinois. And it did start me thinking about what it is we leave behind, and who are we if there is nothing like this left. I started going down all sorts of rabbit holes. I should tell you that this book took 9 years, and it was 70,000 words longer in its first draft than it is right now. So you're welcome, my editor spared you 70,000 other words. But what I was doing was diving into what makes somebody who they are. And in order to do that, I started back in 1800. Right? I went back to when Al's family came over and his grandfather broke horses so that they could pull wagons in Norwalk, Connecticut in the 1800s. I started with the train crash in which his grandfather died. Because you could argue, I do, that if that train hadn't crashed in 1906, then a police officer would not have died in 1960. It became an exploration of all the things that have to happen in order for all the other things to happen. And it's really a look at, I mean, I could write this book about any three of us sitting here in this room. How did we three come to sit here today? I half joke, there might not be a murder in our, but there would be the coincidences and the choices and the generational developments and all the things that had to happen in order for all the other things to happen. So I went down a whole lot of rabbit holes. An exploration of nature versus nurture, right? How do we become who we are? The whole question of the medical experimentation that Al was working on in the Stateville Penitentiary. Leopold and Loeb showed up and became characters in this book. Quick quiz, Leopold and Loeb. Who knows what I'm talking about? Well, you got that. Okay, how about, I've done this with a whole lot of audiences and it almost always turns out the same. How about the two University of Chicago students who consider themselves so brilliant that they could get away with, they killed a 14-year-old to prove they could get away with murder? Does that sound more familiar?
Yes.
Right. It's a generational thing, usually, okay, over 50 and over, and people were nodding, and then you say this, and it's like 30 to 40, they start to nod. Leopold and Loeb were the first crime of the century, in a century that actually already had a whole lot of crimes of the century, but they were, the first use of this crime of the century. They arguably invented true crime in a book that I like to think is kind of reinventing true crime. And if Leopold and Loeb had not killed a 14-year-old in 1924, then a whole lot of other things that followed from that would have meant that this murder might not have happened in 1960. It became an exploration of how we are shaped by history and we shape it at the same time. And it unearthed the stories of 3 generations of 3 families that meant they existed in a way that they otherwise would have been forgotten. As I was writing, Al's steel trap memory began to fade. A few years in, I started to ask him to repeat some of these tales to get more details. And he couldn't even give me the basics that he'd given me before. And eventually I stopped asking because he clearly knew he was supposed to know these stories, but he couldn't access it anymore. And I wrote the dedication about a year ago, yes. And I wrote 2, I dedicated to him. He started it all. And at first I wrote to Alvin R. Charloff, thank you for trusting me with your memories. And I changed it at the last minute to thank you for entrusting me with your memories. Tiny change, but I truly felt like he had handed this tale to me with all of its permutations and complications. And then it was mine because he didn't remember it anymore. And what is a story if there is nobody left to tell it? he was excited about the book. I had to keep telling him that, you know, it's like, you know, I'm writing a book, really? And what is it about? You. And I got this incandescent smile, that I miss. The pub date for the book was May 30th. And that was the day of Elle's funeral. And he was the last survivor of the 3 men in this book, which means had he not told it to me, had I not called you, it would not exist. One of many stories in the world that disappear every day because we don't tell them. I almost canceled the book tour because it felt a little poorly timed. And then I figured Al gave me a tale to go tell. And so I went off to tell it. And I've become a proselytizer, not just for all the, you know, the ethical themes and the historical themes and that are in here too, but for the idea of just remembering to tell about people you loved, the things that happened to you along the way. Most of your children won't listen. But it'll be in there somewhere. And so this has become, in addition to all the other things it is a complicated book. It's become a reminder to me that, you know, we are made up of the things that happen to us and the stories that we pass on to those who come after us. So I came to the Madison Beach Hotel to sit on the beach. Really cool that today, but to sit on the beach and to, you know, to remember, to pay homage. So thank you for your time and for listening to my story. Questions, right?
Perfect. Yeah, excellent timing. You're an outstanding storyteller. It's riveting. I mean, obviously, but questions. Does anybody have questions they'd like to ask? Yes.
I said a quick question. First of all, thank you for sharing what's obviously a very personal story, and you know, it's just interesting to just hear it. When you talk about perspective and him telling you the story originally, and you talked about the fact that it took you 9 years to write the book, is that the reporter in you maybe trying to reconcile the person you knew with trying to tell a story and make sure you're getting all the angles of the story at the same time?
I don't know if it would have taken as long if there were not a personal connection, because yes, I did feel an obligation to do right by it. I felt an obligation to do right by you guys too. I told them before, their dad's picture was on my bulletin board, so literally looking over my shoulder while I was writing it. So yes, the fact that this was about real people who I felt I owed something, I think led me to check and double check and recheck. So yes. That said, I'm a 40-year-long newspaper reporter, so I like to think I already had an obligation to fact and truth. But it is different when you're writing something that is this intimate, that is only newsworthy because you've come across it, right? So you need to justify, I need to justify to myself that no, this is important. It's not just me being prurient. It's not just me bothering these people. It also took 9 years because I went down a whole lot of rabbit holes. I became utterly fascinated at I suggested a cover to them, which they fortunately rejected, but of a murder board, you know, those, the yarn, the push pins and the slightly unhinged people make in the movies, because that's what it became to. That, oh my God, this really directly and fully led to that. And yet, until I came along to make this crazy connection, who knew? And therefore, who knows about whatever it is that happened in my life or your life that crisscrossed and led us to where we are. And then I finally left my job and could work on it full time, and that was the other reason that it took 9 years, was because I was working full time for 7 of them. So, and then the pandemic came along and I just had nothing else that I was allowed to do, right, on my porch. Yeah.
Well, Lisa, I've known you for many years and I know you're a Jewish faith and Jewish people don't typically go to confession. But if you can describe sort of the moment when if you felt that this was a confession.
Was this a confession, and how guilty did Al?
Yeah, if you can talk about
Yeah.
that without giving too much away.
It shaped the rest of his life. So he became a very accomplished, well-known physician who focused his entire life on social determinants of health. He was one of the physicians who coined that phrase. And what social determinants of health are the non-physical, non-medical things that determine health. Wealth or poverty, education, race, all the things we have now come to understand are determinants of health, but were not when he and a colleague coined the phrase. And he says that his interest in this began with this man in this prison. And what was the difference between he and Al? That guy was tested out the wazoo, had an IQ of 142, was, and yet also could not function in the outside world. Not to give away the epilogue, but for me, one of the most moving parts of this entire experience was when I brought Al to Norwalk, to his house, to meet the David Troy's children and grandchildren. The grandchildren had the best questions. They were, because you guys, as you described it to me, didn't want to ask their mother questions because they got the feeling it was too painful. The grandchildren had no similar restraints, and their questions were fabulous, and they asked Al questions mostly that he couldn't answer because he did not know they certainly didn't know their grandfather, and as it turned out, didn't know this guy as well as he thought he had. But he could talk about why he did what he did. And at the end, one of the grandkids said, I haven't looked at the notes of this for a while, but one of the grandkids said, is there anything else you want to say? And he said, I just want to say I'm sorry. And they said, what, for what exactly? And he said, I'm not sorry I helped him get parole. Because given all the facts that I had, I would do that again. I am sorry I didn't return his phone call that day, because Al's theory became that he came to represent sort of the scaffolding and structure of prison life, which, and Al also had a lot of views on prison reform as a result of all of this. And he would say, you take someone who can't cope in the world, you lock them away from that world for decades, and then you send him and are surprised that it doesn't go well. He said, I would have seen him when he called because I think I represented sort of the structure and he needed that. And in fact, when Al didn't see him, Joe went out and bought a gun that week. And then he kind of looked out at you guys and said, I still think he probably would have bought a gun eventually. And I think it's likely that he probably would have killed someone. But it wouldn't have been that day, it wouldn't have been your father. And so if there was any confession, if there was any guilt, that was it. That was it, because you can't argue. It wouldn't have been that day and it wouldn't have been your father. And And that's, all the questions of fate and circumstance and happenstance and choice and sliding doors and all the things that have been fascinated by as a civilization for as long as civilization has existed, is why that day, why that man.
Talking about fate and circumstance, if you hadn't been there, if you hadn't had this relationship, if your mother hadn't married him, or on that day, if he hadn't begun to tell you the story, do you think the story would have ever been told?
No one in his family knew it. So my mother didn't know it. And so I don't know what moved him to say that when he said it, but the odds are good that no, it's not like it would come up. First of all, I didn't see him that often, and second of all, no, it had never come up with my mother, it had never come up with his kid. So odds are that if it hadn't come up that day, it wouldn't have come up. There was a scene in Show Me a Hero that reminded him of something that happened in this book. And so if David Simon hadn't made the other book into a miniseries, would Al have ever told me this story? Probably not. Would the world have continued to spin on its axis? Yes, but it would have been one more story lost.
Besides the phone call, was there either a social determinant or something else that happened at the early parts of the story that if the outcome would have been just a little bit different, it would have made a drastic change on the trajectory of the outcome of the story?
For a long time, I struggled with the fact that I did not like the moral of my own book. Because here was this man who, he was a bank robber. He wasn't a killer. He killed a man, but he spent his youth. I'm sorry, not bank robber. An armed robber. He spent his youth holding up taverns. He happened to cross paths and feel cornered the night of one tavern robbery, which is how he ended up shooting Dave Troy. But why was he an armed robber? I don't know that he ever had a chance. The reason I went back to the 1800s was to look at why his family came here in the first place. Like I said, 3 men on the same starting line. All of them had the immigrant parents. I mean, it's a subject we're debating ad nauseum today. Same argument, right? So they were people who picked themselves up to come from where they were to go to someplace better. Why? For their children. Some of whom were not born yet, but for their children. And they came here and for the same reasons. And yet one, and then I had the stereotypes of my Jewish kid became a doctor, my Irish kid became a cop, and my Italian kid became a gangster. I did not like the moral of my own book. And I didn't like the fact that, this kid, because his father had a horrible childhood and therefore became a horrible father and mistreated this man, does that mean he never had a chance? That we as a society should have written him off from the beginning because there was nothing we could do?
Well, you hear a lot about modern success stories and similar starts, and the person will say, oh, I could have easily turned to this, but my great aunt, always gave me whatever it was, or my.
Then I met Uncle Dante.
Okay.
Their uncle, Evelyn's brother, David Troy's brother-in-law. Yes, I'm sorry, I have a bad time with the generations and the bridges. And arguably, Dante had exactly the same start as Joseph DeSalvo. He, had a father who drank too much and then left. He was brought up in abject poverty. He went AWOL from the army, he thought rules were for other people. And people stepped in when he was young to help. A lot of details behind that, and I could be here all night talking about Dante because I love and adore Dante. But that was when I realized that, okay, this is the point of the book. And Dante took a psychology class when he went back to college, which Joe DeSalvo never got to do, on the GI Bill. Again, you know, the things that are made, the policies that are made at 30,000 feet actually save people down on the ground. Went back to college, took a psychology course, and his professor looked at him one day and said, the difference between a man who, you know, does great things and one who never goes anywhere is somebody who cared about him when he was a child. And Dante Costantino had that, and Joseph DeSalvo didn't. And maybe that is the moral of the entire story. But yes, there were many things that, if they were different, other than that one phone call, would have changed the direction of all three of these men. But Kierkegaard said, life is only understood backwards, but it has to be lived forwards. And if I could have figured out a way to make that a title, that would have been the title, because that's kind of the point. Is you don't know where you're heading toward until you look back on where you came and how things could have gone differently.
I take it, the officer was killed in the course of a robbery.
Yes.
Because until you said that, I thought they were
Yes.
sitting there at the bar.
No,
having a
no,
drink.
there was
Okay.
a robbery,
That
and you know, it was throughout the book, this one shouldn't have been in this place at this time, but was. He was filling in for a friend. He was, you know, and he took a shift that wasn't supposed to be his. And then he was called to on another call that didn't take as long as it should have. And so he was free to do this. I mean, the number of coincidences, the number of moments at which everything could have gone completely differently are stunning when you look back on them. So yes.
We have time for one more question. You've had your, two more questions. One, oh, sorry.
I will stay late and answer all of your questions.
Please, mine was just, given how close you were to the person who first gave you the story and then to the family who was so profoundly affected, as you did your reporting, were there any things you came across that you said, oh crap, journalist in me says I gotta put this in the book, but and you can refuse, you can say, okay, you can say read the book.
No, I there were, and I put them in. I became pretty good at genealogical research doing this. I didn't start out that way. I became pretty good at it. I did hire help because the documents that were in Ireland and Poland and Italy, I did not have the expertise or the language skills, frankly, to go and get. And one of the ones that I hired help for was trying to find David Troy's mother, their grandmother, Bridget. Could not find her anywhere. I couldn't find the ship she came over on. I couldn't find what she did when she first came to America. I couldn't find when she got married. I could not find Bridget Troy. And I worked with genealogists who knew more than I did, and they knew enough to know that Bridget was often Delia by nickname. And they found Delia. And it's the most profound experience to watch as people just like step up off the page and say, you know, hi, yeah, right over here. And they found Delia, and I found the ship that she came over on, and I found the fact that her father sent her away because there were no Irishmen to marry left after the famine. And I tracked her to Stanford, and I still couldn't find her marriage certificate. And on a hunch one day, the family documents said they were married in 1919 in Stamford. And I kept looking in Stamford and I looked all over the state of Connecticut and there was no marriage certificate for Bridget and Charles Troy. And then I remembered that his ship during World War I had been docked in Brooklyn. I thought maybe they, got off on day leave one day and they got married. That wouldn't have been 1919, the war was over, but let's try New York. So I tried New York. And there were Bridget and Charles Troy, married not in Stamford, Connecticut, where they both were very active members of the same church, which is where I suspect they actually met in the first place, but married in Manhattan. And you can check the life stories of the people who were their witnesses from the census, and it has their professions. The only witnesses at their wedding were two strangers in a church to which they didn't belong in Manhattan. And they got married in August of 1920, not 1919. And then I went and I checked their oldest daughter's birth certificate, which was December of 1920. And like I said, these documents stand up and they talk to you. Made me understand Bridget a whole lot better. She was a brittle woman by most descriptions, not warm and fuzzy. I won't say true believer, but that comes with a whole lot of a very observant Catholic woman. And there were family members who really didn't think the whole world needed to know this. I truly don't believe it says anything but, human things about Bridget. And I included it. I don't think I dishonored her memory, but I know that it hurt some members of the family, none of the ones sitting here today. So yeah, and there were moments like that. Because documents they tell a story. So yes.
Mhm.
Okay, one more question, and then I want to make sure we leave time for signing. Did you have a question? Okay, somebody else? No, then, all right.
Did you get a chance to read portions of the book to Al?
To Al, did Al know about the book? Al knew about the book. In the end, it was as if he were learning about his own life through the book, which was somewhat profound. He was so impressed with himself.
With himself, with you.
With me. I did that, that sounds familiar. Dementia is a horrible disease. It is heartbreaking. But I saved his memories. I got his memories. I had memories to give you guys that you didn't otherwise know. That means a lot.
Thank you so
Thank you.
much.